he said something that's relevant to what we're doing here. He said that Israel is now so far gone. I mean, there's no left. There's a handful of dissident voices that are now such a small minority. I mean, the Labour Party has disappeared, the party that founded the state of Israel in this last election. So they moved so far to the fascist right. The solution's going to come from outside. And he makes the point that this draws attention to the importance of what we do here in Australia. We're not insignificant, but more generally speaking, it's what we on the outside can do that is going to make a difference. The pressure we put on our governments, on our media, and in turn create the kind of change that maybe has a hope. So let me, without further ado, getting into my slides. I've got rather a lot to say, and it's rather important perhaps to set the scene in various ways that I thought might be useful. This title was one actually that I used in a talk I gave elsewhere, where speaking as a Jew, as Amara mentioned, I wanted to, this is actually a take or a slight shift or a change from a title that the great Palestinian writer, the American Palestinian Edward Said used. He has a famous essay called Zionism from the standpoint of its victims. And of course it was a famous account of the Palestinian perspective on their tragedy. But speaking as a Jew, it was important for me still to draw attention to the other side, what the Israelis and we are complicit in. So I'm going to run through, as quickly as I can, two basic dimensions to the problem. On the one hand, there's the history, and there's the current situation. I don't know how well informed you are on this, but one of the most important points to make is that we, including me generally, have been enormously misled about almost everything about Palestine and the history of Israel. Going back, as I said at a talk I gave earlier today, to the very earliest beginnings, say in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, the story is the most horrendous, depressing story. And the main point I want to make now is that it's every aspect to it is contrary to what we all think, what the mainstream intellectual and cultural understanding is of the history. And so I want to give some indications of that, and I'm going to run through my slides quickly. That includes the history, which is important, by the way, because where we are today is directly a result of what had happened from not just from 1917, but of course in 1947 and in 1948, the Nakba, the so-called Declaration of Independence, and the War of Independence, as the Israelis call it. It's all crucial to understand that, to understand why the mess is what it is today and how difficult it is to deal with it. So let me just run through my slides. The point I'm making is that there are what are referred to somewhat euphemistically as the contested narratives. I don't like that word, it's too postmodern for my liking. There's the truth and there are the lies. And it's not easy to figure out which is the truth and which are the lies, but it's actually not difficult. It takes a bit of effort, and so I think my role, our role, is to help people in the public and audiences like this to understand how to sort it out. It means reading, but on the one side, for example, you've got one of the leading advocates for the Israeli Zionist story, which is the Harvard lawyer Alan Dershowitz. By all means read it, but then read the alternative views of people like the American historian Norman Finkelstein, who's interesting for me because he's also the son of Holocaust survivors, and he speaks with that as the relevant moral imperative for speaking out as he does, critical of the state of Israel and the Jewish communities. And the title is significant, Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Now you should know that the history and the current situation is being brought out increasingly by significant figures, the so-called new revisionist historians. Ilan Pappé is one of the most significant, even Benny Morris, although he's become problematic, and Avi Schlein. These are actually, all three of them, Israeli Jews. And this is also significant because they're starting to lift the lid off what has been the distortion, the mythology. In fact, Ilan Pappé has a recent book which is brief and very well worth reading called The 10 Myths About Israel. I'm going to give you an 11th and 12th myth. But this is a very useful overview of the point I'm making about the distortions and the propaganda. It's actually very hard to believe for those of us that are educated and we read that we could, and the Jewish community and the mainstream, it's not just the Israel lobby, it's the entire mainstream Western media. And by the way, it's not just about Israel and Palestine. If you happen to be politically engaged, as this group is, if you look at the history of the Vietnam War, of East Timor, it's the same. Latin America and what was going on there, if you know anything about politics, it's extraordinary to discover that the realities are the reverse of everything that we're told. So this is first very hard to believe when you talk to educated people, but that's what's going on here. The first, or the 11th myth, this is not one that Ilan Pape talks about, but I'm adding it. It's significant because many people who don't know what's going on think this, and not least of all, people like Hitchens, the late Hitchens, and others who have been these militant atheists who have been critical of religion. They're actually, in particular, using their atheism as a weapon against Muslims and Islam, which is a whole separate conversation. But their view of the Middle East is extraordinary because they think that the Israel-Palestine conflict, here's a quote, has to do with the exclusive claims to God-given authority made by hysterical clerics on both sides. And they refer to the theological grievances that people have. Now this is insane coming from seriously intelligent, smart intellectuals. You don't have to know much to know that it's not about theology, it's not about religion. Now speaking of that, the founder of the Zionist movement was Theodor Herzl, who was an atheist. The foundations of Zionism and the agenda, the visions for Israel as a home for Jews, wasn't even going to be in Israel necessarily, was by an atheist. They weren't religious to begin with. But the reason I put this quote up here from him is what he said and quoted in Benny Morris. Notice how early the idea of Zionism was completely clear and unmistakable. It's been disguised recently by leadership and by the Israel lobby and various pro-Israel advocates, but look how clearly he says what their vision was. We must expropriate gently. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor Arabs must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. In other words, we have to get rid of the Arabs in their own land. Now this was explicit, and it's very remarkable to go back, as I'm going to show you some quotes from the early founders, who were much more open and honest about their plans. And that's why the history is relevant to what's happening today, because it was never hidden. And today, to pretend that there's a peace process or that there's some two-state solution, it was never intended. And once we understand that, we understand Zionism, and we understand what's now hardly even disguised. Quick history. The whole of the area was the Ottoman Empire. In the early 1900s, there was a correspondence between the British, McMahon, and Sharif Hussein, who was the emir of Mecca. And essentially, they betrayed the Arabs by promising them the whole of Arabia. That was the map that was drawn. They had, in that correspondence, promised it to them, but they betrayed them because they had also planned to give what is now Palestine to the Jews. Of course, they encouraged, the British encouraged the Arabs to revolt against the Turks, the Ottomans, and you see it in the actual pictures of Lawrence and the famous movie, if you haven't seen it, it's a wonderful movie, of the revolt against the Turks. They encouraged them to rise up, which they did, and there's the Hollywood version of Faisal and Lawrence, and there's the Balfour Declaration, which said, and it was actually drafted, I understand, by Chaim Weizmann and leading Jews. It was drafted to say, essentially, we understand that, and we look on with sympathy on a homeland for the Jews in Palestine, in what was promised to the Arabs. One of the important things about it, if you read the history, I've just been reading this and been fascinated by this history, they talked then in euphemistic terms about a homeland, but it was clear from the earliest they meant a state. And this was thinly disguised, but that was the plan from 1917. So to understand today, you have to see how this grew. The great powers, the Jews had a great advantage of dealing with the great powers. And let me read you a quote from Balfour, which tells you so much. This is quite extraordinary. This was written a bit later on. In Palestine, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. The four great powers are committed to Zionism. And Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient world. This is an extraordinary, contemptuous account of the significance of the indigenous people in Palestine on behalf of European Jews who have nothing to do with the place. This is the current situation, and it's important to see how it was already clear. Now, I'm not going to read a lot of these quotes. Forgive me, they're mainly from my prompting, but if I went through them, we'd be here all night. A lot of people need to speak. You're worried already, I can see. She's sure.
No, this stresses me out.
Oh, good.
Oh, yeah.
No, listen, this is the bad news, but I learn from this stuff, and so I do this with with enormous interest. So, but look at the openness with which Ben Gurion, who was the first Prime Minister of Israel, he says, no Zionist can forego the smallest proportion of the land of Israel. A Jewish state in part of Palestine, when they finally got the partition from the UN, is not an end, but a beginning. Our possession is important not only for itself. Through this we will increase our power, and every increase in power facilitates getting hold of the country in its entirety. Establishing a small state will serve a very potent lever in our historical efforts to redeem the whole country. This is in 1937, before the United Nations partitioned Palestine, before the war, and before they got most of it. Now this is where the founders of the State of Israel, by the way, I've had a dispute on Twitter and social media with the leaders of the Israel lobby and the Jewish communities, and one of the leaders of the Jewish community here said on a post in social media, every Prime Minister of Israel has always believed in a two-state solution. It's bullshit, basically. And you can see clearly here what their plan was. It's not a secret. They're not hiding it. And Ben Gurion goes on to say, I don't see the proposed Jewish state as a final solution. Anyway, you get the point. He talks about getting an army and then we'll take over. And he supports compulsory transfer of the Arabs to Palestinians. He doesn't see anything immoral in it. Now, the point was made that we pay respects to the owners, the Aboriginal owners, the traditional owners of this land, and the point was made of the parallel. Here's the famous or infamous remark, Palestine is a country without a people, the Jews are a people without a country. What's really interesting about this, and of course Golda Meir, who was the Prime Minister of Israel, she said there's no such thing as the Palestinian people. It's not as if we came and threw them out and took their country, they didn't exist. It's extraordinary. Now this book I put up here is important because this created a big splash by a woman called Joan Peters, called From Time Immemorial, which set out the academic, historical account of the land was empty, the Arabs came in from somewhere else. What's interesting about this is it was exposed as a hoax, as a fraud by Norman Finkelstein, the guy I mentioned. This got great acclaim from all of the scholars and Middle Eastern experts and academics, but it was a fraud. It's still available, I've got a copy of it, and it tells you the kind of propaganda and the intellectual culture which created an image. Now what's interesting about this quote is that they actually had no illusions about what was really going on, because let me just show you some illustrations. I'll run through some pictures. This was Palestine. This was 1914 in Jaffa. This is Jaffa. Does that look like a land without people?
That's my city.
That's your city. But that's before there were no people, before any people. This is Tiberias. This is Akko. Look at these wonderful pictures of what Palestine looked like. Now, if you go into the desert, I'm sure in the Negev, not many people. If you go here into Simpson's desert, you won't see any people either. But Palestine was hardly empty. There it is. I think that must be. Can you read that for me? Is that Jerusalem?
Which one? The one.
What is the top?
It's Jerusalem.
That's my city.
There you go.
Train station in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So this is not an empty country. Here's another beautiful picture. I don't know where that is exactly. And this is, where's that?
That's Ramle.
Ramle. Okay. So there you go. These are the pictures of what Palestine looked like. This is the Jewish migration that started. Now, we here are hysterical about one boatload of people. Look at what happened in Palestine. The Jewish migration, these were the waves of so-called aliyahs, the people coming to Palestine. These are thousands of people, and the largest number there, in 250,000 people in 39, and of course after the war. But I want to show you how they were swamping Palestine with European Jews. And it's not surprising that the Palestinians were upset about it. Look at the numbers. This is going to be very significant to understand what's going on today. In 1800, there were 2.5% of the population were Jews. By 1947, at partition, there was still only a third, 32%, before we see the United Nations gave away most of the land to them. That's an important statistic. Then this happened. I have to talk about this briefly so you understand, perhaps sympathetically at least understand why the Jews have a particular view of it, which you may not be sympathetic to. I have to tell you something interesting. Just anecdotally, I'm getting Oud lessons. I'm learning the Oud, which is rather interesting. But my teacher, who's a Muslim, and we have wonderful, first, the quid pro quo is that we discuss philosophy for an hour and then he teaches me a little bit of Oud. But he said something to me which is very significant, because we like each other and I admire him and he's a decent bloke. He asked me, is it true what happened in the Holocaust? Were there really 6 million Jews? Now, I respect that he had the decency to ask me that question, because he's a well-educated man. You look surprised. Now, I don't know how many of you know or think about it, but it's important to understand what happened. Now, it's been mentioned, I can't avoid mentioning, my mother was, I'll show you in a minute, was part of this. So the rise of Hitler is part of the story. This appalling stuff, if you've known anything about it. I haven't got time to give it to you, but I'm just putting it on the table as it were here. What happened was, of course, there was the notorious discrimination, the boycott of Jewish shops, which led to this thing, which I'll mention it later, the BDS movement, which we're all involved in. This phrase there in German, in the last sentence says, "Kauf nicht bei Juden," which in German means don't buy from Jews. Now this led to, in the end, the Holocaust. It led to Jews having to wear the yellow star and being rounded up, and among them, that's my mother and grandmother. They were put on, and my mother's the young one on the right there, my grandmother. They survived the Holocaust. They were put on cattle trucks like this, and they were shipped to Auschwitz. That's the notorious picture of the extermination camp. That's the inside of that. You can see on the corner there, the tower, where they were sorted out. Mengele, this guy, my mother saw him every day. They separated people. Some went straight to the gas chamber, and some survived, like my mother and others. This is important because this is what the Jews use inappropriately and frankly disgracefully as an excuse for what's going on in Palestine. The Palestinians had nothing to do with this and aren't to be blamed for it, but I'm trying to indicate to you how this is misused. But this is part of the story, and this was the camp, and that's where it ended up. If you haven't seen these pictures, these are part of the 6 million that were exterminated. Now that story is told in, you may have seen it a long time ago now, the Hollywood version, the book Exodus, about the refugees, the survivors, and they all looking for a place, and they ended up in Palestine. That's part of the story, and it's told in a favourable way. The British were preventing them, and there's a whole story about that, which I can't go into. So in 1947, the United Nations, in 29th of November, divided the country. 55% were given to the Jews, but remember they were only 32%, but they got the majority of the land. This is an extraordinary, again, great power, largesse, dealing with lands, and that's what happened. Now, I won't go through it, but Begin said that the partition is illegal. They didn't regard this as getting half of Palestine. They regarded it as losing half of what's that called, Eretz Israel. This is a bizarre mindset, but that's what they thought. They thought they lost half of the land that they were entitled to. That's the story. Now, one of the things that happened, which you must know about, is the massacre, but this was before the war broke out. On the 9th of April, which is not long ago, the anniversary was recently, the Deir Yassin massacre was one of the most notorious, which frightened a lot of the Palestinians to flee. It was a notorious massacre, and we can't go into the detail, but it was part of the story. But this was before the war broke out. Ilan Pape describes the Al-Nakba, the catastrophe, as the most formative event in the history of the land, including, Deir Yassin wasn't the only one. But it's been erased from memory, and many people have no idea of what happened and what the ethnic cleansing consisted in. It was a systematic and planned cleansing of the Arabs, deliberate. There's then the declaration of the State of Israel on the 14th of May, before the mandate expired. There's Ben Gurion under the picture of Herzl, who we saw before. Then the State of Israel is born, and here's something, again, of the honesty of, by the way, I've got no idea how much time I'm taking.
You're fine.
How much?
You're fine.
I'm just completely lost with the time, so you better wave a hand at me.
I'll give you a ding, ding, ding.
Because I've got so many slides here, I'll hurry up a bit. I shouldn't read all these slides out because they take too long. The gist of this I won't read out is that Ariel Sharon, who was also one of these awful human beings, who became a prime minister and responsible for the Sabra and Shatila massacres in 1982 in Lebanon, he made it very clear again. He said the word democracy doesn't appear in the Declaration of Independence. It wasn't an accident. They didn't intend it to be a democracy. It was going to be solely a Jewish state. Now today, so many years later, when they've declared openly that this is now in that nation state law they've just passed, this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. I mean, we're all surprised. Well, if you know what went on, this was not a secret. Ben Gurion, he's also on, I won't go through it. The War of Independence is significant, so-called War of Independence, this was the Nakba. By the 15th of May, 380,000 Palestinians had already been expelled. So you know, the ethnic cleansing wasn't a result of the war, as some historians want to say. They fled because they were already kicking them out, expelling them. This is what happened. The other thing about this, I won't go through it again, but there's a lot of contrast between the official story and the realities as we now know. For one thing, I won't go through it, but one important point is the military balance. The Jews and the world think that poor little fledgling state of Israel that was just born was immediately attacked by all the Arab countries and was about to be wiped off the map, and a miracle, whether you believe in God or not, saved them through their whatever. It's rubbish. The fact is, if you read the historians, they were militarily and in men under arms superior to the Arab forces all along from the very beginning. They were armed better, they had more men under arms. The fledgling state of Israel was militarily superior, and there was never any question of them being wiped out militarily. This is a very interesting part of the story of how it goes. So again, this is an important contrast. So during that war, the partition on the left there, which was granted, and now I mentioned the number of Jews in the land were 30-some%, still a minority. They only owned 5.8%, nearly 6% of the land. But then, of course, they, through the war, extended their control to the picture you see on the right. The black dots are Palestinian villages that were obliterated. They were wiped off the face of the earth. Something like 500 villages. If you've travelled in that area, you can see the odd rocks with trees growing over them. They've disguised, they've renamed what was the villages, 500 villages in what is now Israel were wiped out. There's a whole story to be told about that. That's one which didn't get wiped out. I've been there, I took that picture. That's Lifta. You can get a taxi from Jerusalem and you see this beautiful city. It's kind of neglected, but it's still standing, and it's a beautiful, you can see what it must have been like. Okay, so let me jump ahead if I can still give you some quick history. I want to mention the 1967 Six-Day War. The joke is that it wasn't a 6-day war, it was a 24-hour war. They won it in 24 hours, the rest was mopping up. Also one important point about this, the Six-Day War, is it's often, standardly, presented by Israel Lobby and everybody else in the world as a war of self-defense. Israel again was attacked, Nasser was threatening, and the Arabs attacked, and they had to defend themselves. That's also a lie. If you read the historians, in fact the Israeli military historians themselves, Miko Pellet's father, Matityahu Pellet and others, and Begin himself, the Prime Minister, said later, this wasn't a war of self-defense, it was a war of choice. They saw the opportunity, a pretext, to wipe out Egypt, which they did in 24 hours. So I'm telling you some of the crucial historical events. Now, of course, this date is crucial because the occupation began here. The occupation of the West Bank began after this date. Occupied it and have never left. War ends, total Israeli victory. Another point of history, if I can jump through this quickly now. Am I still going? How have I got?
I think 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'll try and run. These points are important. There's the so-called peace process, another deceitful account of what actually went on. If you read the American historian Rashid Khalidi, for example, he's got a book. I think the next slide is the book. There it is, The Brokers of Deceit. The entire peace process, the Oslo, Camp David in the year 2000, these were engineered by the United States, and they were designed to block any just settlement from the beginning and all the way through. That's not the story you get, because, there was so much difficulty. The standard story is it was the Palestinians that refused to ever settle. You'll hear this every time from every Zionist lobbyist and other commentators. In fact, Abba Eban, who was the United Nations representative, said the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. It's bullshit. The history is quite the reverse. And if you read people who are respectable and important historians, they'll show you that in every case it was blocked. People who were at these negotiations in Camp David and others will tell you this. People who are actually US officials can tell you the story. So it's not just Palestinian propaganda. This is a shock to discover how contrary the picture is from the one we know. All right, let me jump through. I needed to say, I haven't got time to read it to you. What about this Oslo Accord? This Oslo Accord was a betrayal of the Palestinians. I don't know if the Palestinians are happy for facing this, but the reality is, if you read Edward Said, who was a Palestinian figure, he's got an essay a day or two after the Oslo. He realized immediately that Arafat had sold out the Palestinians. They gave away everything. And that's why we have the mess today, because the Oslo Accords have created what is now the West Bank. That was essentially the Oslo agreements, which I'll get to. So let me jump through all this. Well, that's the short version of what happened. The last picture there, I mean, increasingly, the green areas are what was left of the Palestinians, and this is a famous disappearing Palestine map. The last picture is effectively the Oslo scene where there's little pockets which Palestinians have kind of municipal control. They don't have real control because Israel troops come in and out whenever they want. That's the West Bank. I can't go through it. The fictions about Camp David and so on. Let me run through some of the stuff quickly if I've got a couple of minutes. The Israel lobby is, what's the right, I'm trying to be polite, otherwise I'll say something really rude. They are a pernicious, deceitful bunch. Here's typical, here's what they say. Israel's control of the Palestinian population of the West Bank and Gaza has been virtually non-existent for 20 years. What the fuck is he talking about? Here's no occupation. I took this picture in East Jerusalem when you go inside the Damascus Gate. The first thing you see are these Israeli soldiers. No occupation, my ass. There, I took these pictures. Frisking young Palestinian boys walking in and out. I didn't take that one, but that tells you what East Jerusalem looks like. This is Hebron, Al-Khalil. And that's the street, the Shuhada Street, which is locked off. It was a busy commercial merchant district. It was completely closed. And I took this picture. This is what you have to say is apartheid. The Palestinians have to go along this little narrow area. The Israelis run up and down the street here. This is on the way to the Ibrahimi Mosque. So this is what no occupation looks like. I took these shots. This is, they get frisked there. This was when I was there on the last trip. They get searched and often shot. Often shot.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because I'm going to reference that in my talk. So
oh, good.
I'm going to.
Thank you. Yeah, there's several people, young women, unarmed, are shot dead in places like this. That's the market. I took that picture of the market. And above them, they have to have this mesh there because the settlers, the Jewish settlers, throw down all sorts of refuse and sewage and stuff on it. That's going up to the Ibrahimi Mosque. They're all checked there. No occupation. That's a village called Bil Ain, where I was, and I was at a demonstration there, protest, which I was very pleased to be in. And on the hill there, you see the Israelis. They turn up. This is inside Palestine. This is not Israel. This is nowhere near the wall even. We never get near the wall. They turn up there midday after the Friday prayers, and they start shooting and throwing tear gas, and people have been shot and killed there. This is no occupation. Here's what no occupation looks like. Young boys being mistreated. These are kids. This is what's going on there if you don't know about it. That's the brother of Ahed Tamimi who went to jail, the young kid there. They shoot people dead on the West Bank. In case you don't know, you can check DCI International. Since these numbers now are probably even smaller than they should be. Since the year 2000, Israeli security forces have killed over 8,000, nearly 9,000 civilians, unarmed civilians in the West Bank. And around 2,000 of those are kids.
300 more children dead by now.
Oh, since then. Well, this is probably a year or two old, this figure, yeah. Okay, there's a shot that was caught by security cameras of two kids walking in the afternoon with backpacks, and they were found, incidentally, filmed by some TV crew. Snipers shot their two kids just walking along. They weren't part of a demonstration or anything. Now, if you tell this to Jewish audiences, to the general public, they have trouble believing this, but this is not controversial. Nothing I'm saying is difficult to confirm. That's the wall on the Kalandia crossing where I took these pictures. I didn't take that one. That's what it looks like in peak hour, people going to work. That's the wall. That's the wall. One thing about the wall, if you talk to people on the other side, I've got to wind up. Okay, I'll wind up. They say it's for security. Nothing in the West Bank is for the security of the State of Israel. It's all for expanding the settlements and the occupation and stealing the water. And I can't go through that, but that's what a settlement looks like. That's what I took that picture from Bethlehem, I think. It's Har Homa, which used to look like that. Okay, let me run to the end. Jerusalem is being taken over. Houses are being demolished. Villages are being demolished, like Susia. Gaza, I'll say one more thing and I'll wind up. Let me say something about Gaza. It's a whole complete mess. I wish I had another hour to tell you about Gaza, which you may not know. Firstly, they didn't leave Gaza. They'll also tell you that they left Gaza. The Israeli legal historian Yoram Dinstein, and anybody will tell you, firstly, they're controlling everything, but it's legally under belligerent occupation, as they call it. if I had time, I'd go through the wars, but let me make one point and then I'll wind up. The standard story is that Israel is defending itself against rockets. It's also bullshit. And you can see that from, these are pictures I took in Gaza. By the way, I think in my Arabic, that says Hamas, doesn't it?
It does.
My Arabic's getting better. I didn't know when I took that picture what it said. I took all this graffiti, and then later I realized, that's great, I'm so glad I took that one. And I think that says Al-Quds.
Saraya.
Yeah.
Saraya.
What does the first word mean?
Saraya
Palace.
is
Palaces.
no, sorry, Saraya is the military small group. I
Oh.
forgot. Battalion?
I didn't know that, but I knew I could read the other one.
It's, you know what?
Brigade.
Brigades.
Okay, there's a rocket in that picture, but let me tell you about the rockets. That's a nice shot I took there. I want to tell you about the rockets. This was the cast lead in 2008-9. This is from they've taken it down now. This was from the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They kept a graph of the rocket fire. You'll notice that the rockets, this point it shows you, in June 2008, the rocket fire fell to practically zero because there was a ceasefire agreement between Hamas and Israel. Hamas observed the ceasefire scrupulously. The rockets were some crazy groups, they shoot 1 or 2 rockets. In November, Israel violated the ceasefire by killing some Palestinians, some Gaza Palestinians, and then the rockets started again. In every case, if you read Finkelstein's new book on it and any reliable accounts, they provoke the Gaza people. It's not defense against rockets, it's actually the reaction. Now, the rockets are actually technically illegal in international law, but that's what the rockets are. That's the damage they cause. They make hysteria out of this. That's what Israeli American weapons do. That's what Gaza looks like after Israel has bombed the crap out of the place. These are major atrocities. You only have to look at these pictures. This is a civilian suburb. I was giving a lecture tour in Malaysia, and I had this shocking, moving experience. I'm putting this picture up there, and one of the Palestinian guys in the group was actually from Shujaia, and his family was under this rubble. Now, this is a very shocking business, but you don't have to know anything except to see this to know that this is a major crime by any standards, and you can then read the details of it. Well, oh, and this is my last one. I promise. It's not an accident. There's a doctrine called the Dahia Doctrine, which they formulated in Beirut in 2006, I think, where they flattened some district. The civilians were wiped out, and this is a strategy that is an official military strategy to overreact and kill civilians. These are war crimes. We hanged a lot of people in Nuremberg for these kinds of crimes. I better stop. Thank you.
Keep yourself.